Just for the people who weren't at my talk yesterday, I just want to quickly do another introduction to Patternslib, what the point of Patternslib is. Patternslib lets you enhance the functionality of your website without having to know or care about JavaScript. That's basically the point of it. It's a library of interaction patterns, as the name kind of implies. It's also, besides being a library, a toolkit for writing, packaging, and loading JavaScript modules as patterns. And at the same time, it's also a front-end development paradigm. And I purposely chose the word paradigm to illustrate that it's a way of thinking about how JavaScript gets exposed to users of JavaScript or people who create themes and who potentially might change the HTML and markup of a content management system like Plone. And these interaction patterns are reusable, configurable, and composable descriptions of user interface functionality. In other words, a pattern describes some piece of functionality or something that you could do. And usually this functionality is only available through JavaScript. You cannot do it with only CSS or HTML. And in Patternslib, this is done through special combinations of HTML classes and data attributes. So I gave this example yesterday. It's like the absolutely simplest pattern that exists. If you press a trigger like this button, it toggles a class on this element. And the way you declare the pattern, you have a class with a pattern name, a data attribute where you configure the pattern. You're saying the selector is the element with the ID to toggle, and you want to change the value automatically by default, by convention, the thing being changed as a class. So you don't have to say what is being changed, you just have to say the value is being changed from orange to blue. That's a pattern. So the question arises, what is mockup? Mockup is a fork, and with fork I don't mean like a GitHub fork or a eating utensil. I mean it's a rewrite, an incompatible change of a software project. And it was done specifically for Plone, with Plone in mind. The question might arise, the next logical question, why was mockup forked? What was the point of doing that? And to properly answer that, I would like to first take a tour with you, looking at the history of how it came about that mockup, the idea of mockup was birthed. So the scene where we start off is the Plone conference in Arnhem, the Netherlands. It was the balcony hall of the Musa Sacrum on October 12, 2012. And Cornelis Colbach, I mentioned him yesterday as well, he's a designer and he was demoing Patternslib and a prototype that he made in Patternslib for the Starline's intranet. And Rock Garbas is a Plone developer who was attending that demonstration, and he was really excited about patterns, what it can do. I think he especially liked the way Florian Friesdorf, another developer, was giving the talk with Cornelis, and Florian was talking about how all the patterns are tested and they are very modular, and for Rock this was very attractive. The idea of making modular, testable JavaScript in Plone, because back in the day, in those times, we were still kind of stuck in a very old paradigm of having not a lot of JavaScript, mostly just some jQuery add-ons or jQuery modifications, not being tested at all. And Plone really needed to modernize its JavaScript story. So, what's that? 2-3 months later, Rock starts Mockup, kind of as a patterns for Plone. And he also starts integrating this into Plone app widgets. I was at the Arnhem conference, so I do remember Rock walking around talking about patterns all the time and being totally enamored by the idea. And I remember Godfrey, who was one of the KSS guys, like talking to him, trying to just instill some wisdom that was learned through KSS, and what Godfrey learned about that, and kind of trying to impart some knowledge. I figured this out just by looking at commit logs. So I had to do some archaeology or some play detective to kind of look at the timeline of everything that happened, because I wasn't always involved or always there. And then in early 2013, Rock writes on a blog post about Mockup. I got upset with how JavaScript is abused in Plone. Not 100% sure where this project is heading, but we need to change our attitude towards JavaScript. I hope others feel similar about the effort, or feel similar and would join the effort. And yeah, it was for him a lot about modernizing how JavaScript is being used in Plone and making it testable and modular. And he also, a little bit later in 2013, he writes a blog post where he explains the choice of Patternslib, because there were still some people who were wondering whether this is the right approach. And at that time, Mockup was using Patternslib. Mockup wasn't a fork. It was just, he was writing some patterns for Plone, and it was also totally still dependent on Patternslib. And in March, a PLIP was proposed. PLIP is a Plone improvement proposal. And in that, Rock proposed it, and he wrote, re-implementation of current JavaScript found in Plone core. This code is not rewritten in its entirety, but getting transformed into patterns as part of the Mockup project, so that it can be encapsulated and tested. Then, what's that? 9 months later, over time, but 9 months later, the proof was there that Rock decided to fork. And he created a package called Mockup Core. And in Mockup Core, he rewrote the core components of Patternslib. And he broke compatibility, and he made a hard fork. And I expected there to be some kind of documentation, some historical record of some kind of discussion, maybe even a disagreement, or people trying to kind of figure out the way forward and discussing these things. And I found absolutely nothing in GitHub issue tracker or in the mailing list or anything like that. It looked to me to be relatively a unilateral decision. And then in June of last year, Rock stepped down as the maintainer and moved on to doing more JavaScript work outside of Plone, and I don't exactly know whatever else, but more Nix and JavaScript, and became less active in the Plone community. And this was a little bit of a shock for some people, because at that time he was really a singular force pushing forward this thing to a large degree, and he had a lot of knowledge about the whole project was kind of in his head and not necessarily spread around that much. I mean, he did a lot of effort in documenting, and I think Nathan and Franco and Johannes might know more about the challenge involved in taking over this project when he stepped down. I don't know how much of a challenge it was, but I imagine it was quite a challenge. And Nathan Van Giem took over as Mockup maintainer, and Johannes and Franco was flanking him and really helped out getting the project ready for the Plone 5 release. So coming back to the question, why did he fork? So I'm sorry, but I'm still not going to answer it. I first want to just discuss what the core components of Patternslib are, because that's important for us to know why he forked, because we're going to go through the reasons that he gave for forking. So Patternslib consists of a registry, registry is where the the patterns get registered. When you create a pattern, it automatically gets registered in the patterns registry, and the registry also has a scanner that scans the DOM, the HTML DOM, looking for these special class names that are associated with the patterns to identify the patterns that are configured on this page and to load them or configure them. So it also has a parser. The parser reads that data attribute, like in the example of pat toggle, it was data pat toggle. It reads that data attribute and parses it to get the configuration out there. And then it has a loader that initializes the patterns. Once the patterns are registered and scanned, and we know which patterns are going to have to be initialized for a specific page, all of them are being initialized by calling their init init method. And then, of course, Patternslib also consists, those are the core components, and then, of course, there are also still the individual patterns. So Rock stated 3 reasons for forking. The first reason was that he didn't like Patternslib's configuration syntax. He said that it makes a parser more complex. It means more documentation because you have to explain the configuration syntax, and he wanted the mockup project to be about having to avoid learning new things as much as possible. So the configuration syntax of Patternslib is supposed to emulate CSS. And the reason for this, there was a very well thought out reason, and that is that patterns is supposed to be used by people who are not software developers. Still potentially technical people, people who do HTML and CSS. So maybe you would say someone like that is a software developer, but not a programmer, not someone who writes JavaScript, not someone who writes Python, not someone who deals with JSON. Cornelis, for example, he's the person who came up with the whole idea of Patternslib, kind of the visionary behind it, and someone who still plays very much a driving force role in the development. He doesn't understand JSON. For many people, this idea is like, how can he not understand JSON? But he doesn't understand it. He doesn't like it, and he doesn't. Also, he's very visually orientated. Just for him, looks like this weird foreign stuff. Curly brackets. He immediately gets a visceral reaction. But what he does understand is CSS, and people who make HTML and CSS-based prototypes understand CSS. So the idea was to expose the configuration of patterns in a way to people that was intuitive and understandable to them. And at the same time, CSS is the lowest common denominator between JavaScript developers and designers or people who write the markup in the CSS. So that was the configuration syntax. If you consider this CSS piece of CSS, you have 3 rules here: background repeat, background position, and background image. And for each of them, you have an argument or a value. CSS allows you to combine them in one line. So you can say background no repeat, center, and the URL. It's just a shortened version of that. And because Cornelis wanted patterns to be configurable as CSS, he thought it was natural to also allow this. And in patterns, you can do that. If you have 2 variables or 2 configuration options, he calls them properties because in CSS you talk about properties, so the properties of the pattern. And they both have the same prefix, control-*stop or control-nav. Then you can shorten it by writing one line. Additionally, he thought of a shorthand notation where if you have 3 values, you can write them just the values. You don't have to do the key value separated by a colon. He wanted that, and this is not a CSS thing, right? You cannot do that with CSS. It's just something that he thought he would like it to have such a shorthand notation. This is something that Rock particularly complained about, that he thought that this doesn't make sense and this makes the parser complicated. Just a note about that, I never use that. I also sometimes write patterns. Like other people, also sometimes have to add patterns to markup, and I always make sure to write it out in long form. Yeah. In any case, so he wanted to cut down on complexity or complications, and so he made the parser really, really simple. I mean, if you compare the code of the patterns parser and the mockup parser, the mockup parser is maybe, I don't know, 25 lines, and the patterns parser is maybe, I'm not completely sure, I should have checked, but maybe 150 lines. But at the same time, it's simple because it doesn't support a lot of stuff. It doesn't support this grouping that I showed previously. It doesn't support the shorthand notation. It doesn't support restricting allowed values. In Patternslib, you can say that this configuration argument takes only these, it only has these allowable values. And it's also naive in the sense that anything that looks like configuration, it will happily parse and present that to you as configuration. So the Patternslib parser is stricter. It's strict, and if people do things that don't conform to how the configuration settings of the pattern were configured by the pattern creator, then it will spit out an error. It will say like, you're giving an invalid value or something like that. So this is for me a little bit analogous to dynamic, well, like to loose or strict type checking, right? Python's type checking system is dynamic, and JavaScript's type checking system or type system is dynamic, but Python is strict and JavaScript is loose. In Python, you cannot, you have strict separation between the different types, and in JavaScript you don't, and there's all kinds of issues by having such a loose way of doing things. That's why people make things like TypeScript and other static type checking for JavaScript. The second reason that he gave was that he wanted to scan patterns outside in, and Patternslib scans patterns inside out. Inside out, outside in, what that means is you either go from the, you either start in the most deeply nested level of the DOM tree, in other words, the leaves, and you initialize those patterns first, and then if those patterns are potentially inside DOM elements that are also patterns, then you initialize the parents second and the grandparents third. He wanted to do it in the opposite way, and he said that cuts down on complexity. I didn't really understand his argument for why. I discussed it with Wichert Ackermann. Wichert Ackermann was the guy who wrote the scanner and made a decision of doing it inside out. Inside out. And the reason generally is when you have a pattern inside another pattern, you usually want the child to first have done its stuff, to do whatever it needs to do before you do it with the parent. It kind of makes sense to me, and I just didn't see, when I did the merging later, I didn't see a good reason why it had to be changed. And then his third reason was that it was difficult to keep up with the changes that were being made in Patternslib. And I mean, that was an issue back in the day. They were refactoring and learning a lot about how to do things in Patternslib and changing stuff. And he felt that he all the time has to incorporate changes from upstream, and that this was becoming difficult for him to do. Meanwhile, at the same time as all these things were happening, that I was now, this timeline that I showed from 2012 till 2014, Patternslib was still being continued, still being developed, and being deployed in lots of sites. And in the first half of 2014, the Plone Internet consortium was created. And it was based upon a design-driven approach, and it was based upon a prototype, and this prototype was using Patternslib. So one might wonder, why choose Patternslib if the Plone community moved towards Mockup? Well, the reason for that is basically the intranet that Syslab made for Star Alliance. Guido Stevens went and looked at intranets that were made in the Plone community from various different companies, and he decided that this intranet was the one sorry, I must maybe say why he did that. He did that with an eye towards the Plone Internet project. He wanted to find out what is the best approach, or I don't know if he wanted to find the best intranet. I don't want to phrase it that way as if it's like a winner-loser thing, but he just wanted to see what is out there, what have people done, and kind of incorporate the knowledge. And he saw this one, which is a very different approach to how Plone stuff is often being done, due to it having a completely different UI. But this is Diazo, right? Diazo allows this, which is so awesome about Diazo. And he decided that the Plone Internet project needs to be based on this idea that it's design-driven, that you have a prototype that is made with patterns. And he also, this is all made by Cornelis Colbach, right? The guy I mentioned in the beginning. And there was also agreed upon that, you know, he needs to be working on the Plone Internet system as well, because this is kind of his, this is the stuff he comes up with. You cannot easily take him out of the picture and put someone else in there and get the same result. And he uses Patternslib. And Patternslib is his brainchild, and he knows exactly how it works and how to use it. So in 2014, we had the status quo that we had two patterns-like projects. They were duplicating one another's functionality, and they were incompatible with one another. And they were both being used in important projects in the Plone community, the one being Plone 5 and the other one being Plone Intranet. And it got worse because it's not possible to use both in the same site. You cannot use Mockup and Patternslib in the same site because they use the same, Mockup kept the naming convention, so the parsers and the registries would try to parse and instantiate and initialize the same patterns. So both Mockup and Patternslib would be trying to do this. At the same time, the Mockup patterns that were created were keeping the, like sometimes you had exact same pattern basically. Pattern check shouldn't be there, I don't know why that's there, but pat toggle, sortable, modal, and tooltip are all patterns that have their original equivalents in, or have their original versions in Patternslib, and then they were duplicated in Mockup with the same name. There were also other potentially less technical challenges about this whole fork, which is that confusion. People didn't know what was going on. Developer attention and resources were being split across two competing projects, and a lot of work was being duplicated. So it became increasingly clear as we were working on Plone Intranet, and as that was going forward, and as it became clear how incompatible these two projects were with one another, that we need to get these two things back together again and solve this problem of spreading the resources too thin and having two incompatible competing projects within being used within the same community. So in January 2015, there was the Alpine City Sprint in Innsbruck, and there I worked on doing this merge, and I updated, one of the first things I did was to update the Mockup patterns to handle being scanned inside out. And that wasn't really particularly hard. For the most part, it all just worked actually. I don't remember having to do a lot of hoop jumping and stuff there to fix that. I merged the two registries so that there's only one registry, so you don't have these two competing registries and scanners. The registry and scanner is kind of the same code. And I changed the loader to handle the way Mockup patterns are initialized, because they are initialized in a subtly different way than the Patternslib ones were being initialized. I couldn't merge the parser. The Mockup parser and the Patternslib parser are just so different in the way they are being used. The Mockup parser is very implicit. There is almost no configuration to it. You can only pass it, as far as I understand, you can only pass it default values. Whereas the Patternslib parser is much more explicit, and you can tell it stuff like I said before, allowable values, or is this thing multi-valued, or also if it's a default value. After that sprint, at least we had the situation that both Patternslib and Mockup patterns could be used in the same site. So there was already quite a win.
Yeah, except when the names clash, right? Because we have a pat toggle in Mockup and a pat toggle in Patternslib, and a pat sortable in Mockup and a pat sortable in Patternslib. So at the Munich Plone 5 theming sprint, I again got some time to work on this, and I managed to merge the Mockup base pattern into Patternslib and finally remove Mockup core, which Mockup core was kind of like the birth of the fork. And they were features taken from Mockup. The base pattern, which I really liked. It's a really nice way of doing it, and it was, in my opinion, an improvement to the way that Patternslib did it. I merged that from Mockup, and I've started changing some of the Patternslib patterns to use this base pattern. It's not a requirement, but it makes life a little bit, it's just a bit nicer way of doing things. And then Patternslib had a JSON configuration option that you can configure your patterns with JSON, which kind of shows the mindset behind patterns, behind Mockup. From what I can tell, Rock was for him more important to have encapsulated, testable JavaScript modules that can be reused and used in different areas in the site, than potentially this idea of exposing JavaScript to people who are not JavaScript experts or who don't know any JavaScript, or allowing designers to create prototypes without having to use any JavaScript, but getting the value of JavaScript functionality. So Mockup, from what I could tell, was more like a developer-driven venture project. And one of the things that people wanted was JSON configuration, which, yeah, I think it might have value, but it shows the different approaches to the two projects. There are still some issues that remain. The one is that we still have two parsers. The other one is more kind of pernicious, some of the other ones. And that is, for example, coming back to these two different approaches. Like I said, the Patternslib parser, or the Patternslib configuration, is meant to look like CSS. And CSS is dash separated. And Patternslib configures their patterns with bumpy case. And it's just like, I don't know, it's a change, again, I guess, to make the developers feel more comfortable. Developers are more used to bumpy case variable names. So I don't know why that change was made, but that's what it looks like to me. Again, this thing of who is your intended audience, who's your consumer. And in Patternslib, your consumer of it is the designer. Also, of course, the duplicate patterns causing name clashes. And yeah, the different approach, which I'm kind of mentioning throughout. So luckily, after all this merging work, the Mockup project is now simply a specific collection of Patternslib patterns for the most part. And these were my original goals, generally speaking, and it looks like a lot hasn't been done, but I mean, the first three things were significant, and not each bullet point is the same size or complexity. These other 5 points, I would love it if we could work on this at the sprints on Saturday and Sunday. So there's a clear vision or picture of what needs to still be done to kind of really complete this merge or complete this getting back together. For the one thing, removing the duplicate patterns. In other words, that means like merging them into the upstream ones so that you only have one pat toggle and not two pat toggles. Also, to update the Mockup patterns to use the Patternslib parser shouldn't be too much work. And moving generic patterns out of Mockup. Mockup, Nathan and I discussed this at the Plone Open Garden in Sorrento, and he completely agreed that Mockup should be Plone specific, and if there's any patterns in Mockup that could be reusable outside of Plone in other projects and in non-Plone websites, we should move them out and potentially put them in Patternslib or in their own repositories or something like that. And a lot of people are coming to me and asking me like, okay, that's great, Patternslib, how do I use the Patternslib patterns? Because we have the Mockup patterns and the Patternslib patterns. So I want to, that's for me almost the highest priority. but I don't want to say something is more important than something else because it depends. But to expose them and make them easily available is an important thing, and also to document how to use them and how it works is important. So, yeah, I'm running a little bit out of time, so I'm getting a bit rushed, but I just want to discuss the question of whether this fork was worth it. And there are sometimes good ideas to fork. Forks can have really good reasons, and there are advantages to it. Forks foster competition. There's something Darwinian about forks and about competition. You have the survival of the fittest. If something is better than something else, you let them compete, and the superior implementation will often, not necessarily, but will often, show itself through being more popular. And in software, this is very true. I mean, you have all kinds of frameworks and stuff competing with one another and trying to get developer attention. That's often the thing you're trying to get, right? Like mind share, not only developer attention. I mean, in patterns, you definitely want designer attention as well, but you're trying to get mind share. If not enough people are interested in something, it dies. So there's this definitely Darwinian environment there, and this is, so competition can be used for good in this way. Forks allow experimentation. It's kind of a related point, but if you make a fork, you can try out things that in the upstream project or in the previous project wasn't, being tried out. And a fork can also rectify a social, legal, or policy issue. Makes me think of, for example, LibreOffice being forked from OpenOffice, and the competition one, you can think of LibreSSL being forked from OpenSSL. And I mean, there's so many things. There's a Wikipedia page that lists forks from 1985. Why might it be a bad idea to fork? Well, you have sunk costs in the sense of lost. This is like the first point is more contingent on if the fork dies off. And by the way, I read up about it. That's by far the most common case. By far the most common case, a fork dies and the original project survives. And if that happens, you have these the lost time and effort and cost of doing that. If you want to merge the fork, you know what? Okay. See, I was a little bit scattered there. This is actually more the cost of this fork. There's also the cost of merging, because we've decided to merge now again, and there's the cost of that. There's also the opportunity cost. Opportunity cost meaning what could have been done with the time and effort and resources that are now spent merging. You could have done other stuff with that time and effort and resources. There's also the resource dilution, because you had people working on two different incompatible systems. And there's also fear, uncertainty, doubt, and confusion about how things are going. Are there alternatives to forking? What else could have been done? Well, one thing you can do is to get your work merged upstream. This is generally how open source communities, there's one way of being an upstanding citizen in the open source world is that you contribute back and you work with other people in that project. Another way is, let's say there's some belligerent person there, or you struggle to reach out to them, or this for whatever reason, it's not so easy to get your stuff merged upstream. You can also potentially work on adding your own features, but maintain compatibility. In other words, for example, Rock could have made the base pattern, which I think is a really good idea, but he could have done it in such a way that it's not an incompatible implementation of the same thing. For the most part, those things are social. It's really about working together with other people and discussing things and coming to conclusions and reaching out to people and discussing things. It's social, it's not technical. And that's actually very, very, very difficult, because you might have to deal with egos and with different opinions, and you might have to state your case, and you might have to argue or at least discuss things. And maybe for someone, for a lot of people here, myself included, it's easier to often just write code. Just write code, and you can do it yourself. A computer's not going to argue with you. But it's not necessarily always the best way. Often, maybe a better way is to actually solve the social challenge of working together and collaborating. Sometimes collaboration can be a superior way of doing things than pure Darwinian competition. And Rock kind of agrees because he wrote this on his website. He says, I wrote a few jQuery plugins to improve UX in Plone and then started a rewrite of Plone's front end called Mockup, which was, or is, more of a social than a technical challenge. Peter Hintjens is quite bold, and he says the community is more important than the project, than the product, which is kind of a continuation of the same idea. Finishing off, I still think Patternslib is a very good idea, a very good fit for Plone, for these reasons. It's small, it's overseeable, it's understandable. Something like AngularJS, it's for me black magic. I've done some AngularJS development and I really like it, but I don't see it necessarily a good fit for having it in core Plone. Patternslib can be added progressively. You can add it to old sites. You can add it in certain pages. You can add it piecemeal. You don't have to swallow the whole thing hook, line, and sinker. You can add patterns here and there and kind of progressively enhance and improve your site. It fits well to how Plone development is done, because in Plone you often write browser views, and in Patternslib, especially with the injection pattern, which I mentioned yesterday, this is all about injecting existing HTML. So you can just inject your browser views, and you can also write the Patternslib markup in your browser views. So it fits quite well. I mean, people who've been working with this in Plone Internet will know what I'm talking about. Doesn't need a JSON API. Lots of advantages to that, but again, when you are trying to target designers and you want to make something easy for designers to use, they're not going to use JSON. They want to deal with JSON. And it's also a good thing because Plone doesn't have a JSON API. So it works for Plone now. And when Plone eventually does get a JSON API, which I think would be awesome, then there's also still the opportunity of writing rich single-page apps in something like Angular or React or whatever and using the JSON API. But that's not where we are right now. And Diazo is so awesome. Diazo is like as if it was made for patterns because you can create your themes. You can have a designer, someone like Cornelis, create a theme. Not only a theme, but because through the power of patterns, create a clickable prototype and a usable prototype. And then you can just use Diazo to incorporate that into your Plone site. And you can have this separation of roles of designer and, let's say, Plone expert. And that's my talk. I hope I didn't go over. Yeah, 1 minute, I think. I hope I didn't bore you too much. I think my previous talk was more exciting, but this, in my opinion, really had to be discussed, and there was a lot of confusion and uncertainty around Mockup and Patternslib, and there is still, as you can see, it's still an ongoing topic, an issue, and I'm hoping that more people will be willing to sprint on this Saturday and Sunday, especially the stuff I mentioned there, because it doesn't help if I'm doing all of this for the very same reason why it doesn't help when any one person does a lot of stuff. You need buy-in from the community. You need other people to be aware of what's going on. You need people to know what's going on. Otherwise, people can make unilateral decisions and push things in a certain direction that if more people know about it, they might have, kind of put the brakes on a little bit and first discuss it, first figure out what the best approach is. So I'm really hoping that, people get involved. And at the same time, not only those things I mentioned, but Max also mentioned that the JavaScript widgets in Plone don't conform to this specification for accessibility. That's also a very important topic. So that's another thing that we want to sprint on and look at. So that's not in the slides, but that's also an important topic. Thanks very much. I don't know if
and this whole work was done in the last year, but still I can understand why Rock forked Patternslib, because if I remember correctly, he had issues to bring his idea back upstream, and I also don't think that it was not a very big problem for Plone that the fork happened, because we got Plone 5 out and we could use Mockup and Plone Up widgets since I don't know, 1 year at least in production. And yeah, the most of the work which went into mockup was more developing patterns than we had than having issues with the framework, like not being compatible with Patternslib. This was not so much of an issue, but still no one understood really why there were 2 projects. But now, as you rolled up Rock's arguments for forking, I think there's some, for example, I actually liked the JSON parser. This is something which I don't want to lose, for example, but we have it because it's just in Patternslib now.
Yeah, I think there was definitely innovation. There was definitely things being done in mockup that were good ideas, and this is coming back to the competition argument, right? They're having competing projects, and then you have the innovation, you have new things being tested, and that was a positive thing out of what happened. I didn't see a record of these things being discussed, though, and maybe this happened in emails, private emails, and I just didn't have access to that. That's probably what happened. And it's definitely possible that people in the Patternslib side, and back when that stuff happened, I wasn't really very involved. I wasn't writing patterns and I wasn't doing any stuff there. But it's definitely possible that the people were averse to change or averse to people bringing in new ideas. That's, I can imagine, I can easily see that happening. So people have responsibilities from both sides. This social challenge of working together that's why it's so difficult, because it's not just one person cannot fix a social challenge. Then it wouldn't be a social challenge. It has to be multiple people coming together and working together and collaborating. And yeah, I don't know, like how you do that. That's what makes it difficult. I want to definitely say I'm thankful. Rock did a lot of great work, and he really did a service to the community to try and push forward this whole thing of making testable JavaScript and modernizing the way things are being done. And I acknowledge and honor that, and I think that's great. I'm not completely convinced that the fork was a good idea, but I also want to say that's my opinion. And I try to kind of present this in a relatively even-handed manner. Yeah. Okay. Oh, yeah.
Just a quick question. I came late, maybe you asked that already. I'd be interested in learning how many people in the audience are willing to sprint on mockup and Patternslib this weekend. If you would raise your hands.
Mike also there.
That's substantial. Great. Totally not me.
Okay, thanks a lot, everybody. Sorry for the people who are coming after me.